All right, artists. So we are going to be working on the monochromatic portion of our color chart. I'm just reviewing this as I've already kind of gone over it, and I want to start from scratch. So basically what you need to have happen is you're going to choose a secondary color or you're going to choose a tertiary color. I chose to do blue purple. So I took a lot of blue, just a little bit of my cool red, and mixed them together. And now I have a nice pile of my blue purple waiting for me. And we're going to start with our highlights. And one of the things we talked about is the lightest that you can go on white paper. The lightest you can go on white paper is white. So we are going to take some of our white and just paint it into that first box. You want to be careful, try not to get it all over the desk, but really fill in that space and try to be neat. Remember, we're focusing on the cleanliness of our lines. And we really want to try and practice being neat with our lines. You can tell I'm moving my hand around in different directions. At some point, I may even move my paper around in different directions. It just depends on how well I can see what I'm doing and trying to get those nice clean edges. So now I've got, excuse me, my initial white. So what I'm going to do is take a pretty good amount of white. I've noticed that some people like to take just a tiny little bit, but we're going to be using this quite a bit. So I want to make sure that I've got a lot on my palette paper. So that way I can continue to use it. And I've cleaned off my palette knife because, again, I don't want to cross-contaminate any of my colors. And I'm just going to take a tiny little bit of my blue purple. So whatever color you chose to do, whether it was a tertiary color or a secondary color, I'm taking just a tiny bit because I don't want to change this a lot. I only want to change it a little bit because I want to try and just make a really, really pale blue purple. And I'm going to take that and just like we've mixed before, just kind of like take the palette knife, pick it up, smush it back down, pick it up, smush it back down. We're not mixing. That doesn't really do much of anything. You want to mix until there are no streaks of white or color left in what you are doing. And when you're working with smaller amounts, it goes fairly quickly. When you start to get into bigger amounts, it takes a little bit longer and a little more patience. I know we are lacking in the patience department, but we're going to try, okay? So how do I know if this is correct or if this is what should go next? Well, I can kind of hold it here and take a look. It should be a little bit darker than my white. It's actually a little too dark, so I think I'm going to add a little bit more white to this, just to make it lighter. Because I don't want it to be white, I just want it to be a very, very light version of that color. And you can also just quickly test on the paper next to your color. So I can just put just a tiny little bit right here, right next to that white. And it's hard to see on the camera, but I can already see that it is definitely darker than that white that's there. It shouldn't be dramatically darker. It should just be a little bit darker. So I'm just going to go ahead and paint that rectangle in. And this is going to be my first sort of highlight value that I'm creating with my blue purple. And again, just trying to keep those nice clean edges, trying to stay in those lines as best I can. And now I'm going to move on to the next version of this color. And what we can do now is, normally I would say, okay, let's take this color, let's scrape it up, let's put it on our palette. But since we're only doing a quick strip, we're just going to continue using the same pile of paint. I've left it on my palette paper. So now I'm just going to take another little bit of color from my blue purple pile that I have in the middle of my palette. And I'm gonna mix it in. And we're gonna see if that gets a little bit darker. One thing you want to think about when you are using your tertiary color or even a secondary color is how dark that original color is. So when you see this color, it even looks through the camera pretty dark. So when I get to the end here, it's not going to be this color. However, if I had something more like a yellow-green, a yellow-orange, maybe even like a reddish purple, depending on how dark that color is, I may end up with that at the very end here. But we're going to test these out, we're going to see. So I can't quite tell if this is darker just by holding it, so I'm going to paint a little bit right next to it, and oh, I can definitely see that that's darker. Again, the camera isn't really showing it very well here, but my next one is definitely darker than my first. So I'm going to paint that in. And also remember that these particular acrylic paints, they're going to dry a little bit darker than how they look when they're wet. So if you want something to be lighter, because I'm looking at this, it's kind of a big change, but I'm going to stick with it and just try to keep making the next ones a little bit darker by adding more of my blue purple. So each box is going to continue in that same fashion, and I'm going to work my way down until I get to my last box here. So I'm going to mix up this color really quick. I'm going to paint this whole row, and then I'll come back and you'll see how we're going to do our dark version of this. All right, artists, so I have finished my first row, and you can kind of see, here's how dark my original color is, and my final sort of light highlight value still isn't quite there. I want to get a little bit closer to this color because it's so dark. You may not have this problem because you have a lighter color. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to continue to work with the color that I have. So I'm kind of scraping it up a little bit, and I'm going to take about half of what I have mixed on my paper palette. And I'm going to add my blue to that for at least the next few colors, just so that we can see it getting darker and darker. So I'm going to, again, take a bit of paint. It's a little bit more than what I have been taking. And I'm going to add it to that. And this is going to change a little bit more, which is what I want. Because eventually I'm going to be working with just this straight color and then a little bit of black. The color is so dark that it doesn't need a lot of black to make it even darker. So we're going to be relying on a lot of these highlight colors to sort of get some of these darker tones, because they're going to be darker highlights that look a little bit more like our mid-tones. So I already know that this is darker. I can visually see that this is darker than what's previously been mixed on my palette. So I'm going to go ahead and paint this into the first box. Because this is practice, I'm not really saving a ton of the colors I'm mixing here, because we're going to do a slightly little bit different when we're mixing for the vector project that we're going to be doing. And if you were struggling to kind of make differences earlier with adding the color, and it wasn't really changing much, you can do exactly what I just did. You can take about half of what you mixed up and then add your color to that, and you'll see it start to change. So you can see there's a pretty good difference between these two now, which is what I wanted. But it would have taken me much longer to get there if I had been using the same amount of paint the whole time. So at this stage, I'm going to be adding probably more and more blue, more parts of blue. So you can see that this is a lot more than what I was using earlier to sort of mix my values. And this is hopefully going to help me get this to be a lot stronger and darker quicker. And of course, I'm mixing these up fast. You don't need to mix them up quickly. I'm doing that strictly for the video. And that's a pretty good darker color there. Rinsing my brush off and of course drying it off. You don't want to get a lot of water into the paint. This paint is meant to be used thick. If you start adding water into it, it's going to start to thin out and you're going to get uneven areas of paint. You're going to start to see streaks, which some of you may have experienced already. If you didn't mix up enough of a color, you may have been trying to kind of get just the little last bit of it with a little bit of water on your brush, and it ended up thinning out the paint. We want to try to avoid that if we can. We use that in a technique that's called glazing, but we're not really going to be glazing much for this particular project. We're just going to be using our flat color. So you can see that's already getting darker. And unfortunately, because of the way this camera is, you're not going to probably see a lot of the nuances that are going to happen as I start to add more and more of the darker blue purple. But you'll have to take my word for it. And if you're in my class, you can see my example when it's up on the board, and you'll definitely be able to see the difference then. So I'm trying to get to a point where I can start using my straight up blue purple, which is going to be pretty dark, which is probably going to happen around here. So I'm going to do a few more versions of this, and then I'll come back when I'm ready to start with that paint so you can see how many steps it took me to get to that point. All right, guys, so as you can see here, it took me quite a while to get to this point where I'm actually going to use my straight up blue violet. So again, if you have a lighter color, this isn't going to happen. You're going to actually start adding a little bit of black at a time to make that color darker until we get to our last box, which is going to be black. But as you can kind of see on the screen, I've already gotten pretty dark just by mixing it in with my light highlight value. So now I'm using my straight up blue. And you can see, you really can't see on the screen, but I can see that it does have a pretty decent jump to dark. And I'm not going to have a lot of room for using and mixing black with this. So I'm going to mix about a 50-50 version of this using the blue violet, using black, which is going to get painted here, and then I'm going to end up with my last spot being completely black. So again, I know it's hard to see on the screen. I'm going to do my best so that you guys can sort of see that, but this camera makes it a little difficult. So just a tiny bit more black in there. And I'm going to mix up that really dark version of this before going to all black. And then that's going to be the end of our monochromatic strips, which should help you when starting the vector painting, which is going to be the next set of videos that you guys are going to see. So I'm just going to hurry up, get this color mixed up, make sure it's nice and dark. I think I'm going to put just a tiny bit more of the blue in there, just so it's not quite so black. And as you can see, I've used up almost all of my color on here. So when you're mixing your tertiary color for your project, you're going to want to make sure you mix up quite a bit of it so that you do not run out mid-project. It's much more difficult to recreate the color than to make it and kind of just keep using it as you go. So that's a nice dark version mixed with some black. So I'm going to paint that in. And then of course my very last spot is going to be black. And that is how we create our monochromatic strips. You can kind of see it getting a little bit darker on the screen. This is very, very dark, almost midnight bluish purple. went out of my lines a little bit there, so I'll have to be much more careful when I do my vector painting. And then finally, my last box is going to be my straight up black. And then that will be our strip. And then of course, just remember that when you're cleaning up, if you want to save any of your colors to use for the vector project, you totally can. But if you don't have enough, I would suggest just mixing some fresh before you get started. All right, and with that, that is the end of our strip. So I hope you guys have as much success as I did.